Everyone, thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Nicole Keane and I'm the creative programmer here. I hope many of you have been able to visit V&A Dundee to see Night Fever designing club culture 1960 to now in person. From the personal to the political, clubs and club culture play a major role in our contemporary lives, offering a space to find like-minded people and moments of collective joy. Tonight, we are joined by artists Jeremy Deller and Vinka Peterson, both who have work in Night Fever, along with Night Fever co-curator and design historian Dr. Kat Rossi. Together, they're going to explore how clubs intersect with wider society and why club culture should be preserved, protected and promoted. A little bit more about our speakers. Jeremy Deller is a Turner Prize winning artist who represented Britain at the Venice Biennale in 2013. He's been producing projects and artwork since the early 1990s and often shows and works outside traditional gallery spaces. Vinka Peterson is a multidisciplinary artist who works in the area of social practice. Her work emerges from her deep social and political engagement with underrepresented communities and often explores the theme of collective joy. As well as being the co-curator of Night Fever, Dr. Kat Rossi is an associate professor at design history at Kingston School of Art in London. Her research interests include club culture, Italian design, craft, past and present. She's curated exhibitions and installations at the Venice Architectural Biennale and with the ICA and Vitra Design Museum. Before I invite them to join us, I wanted to draw your attention to some of the Zoom functions we're going to be using this evening. Jeremy, Vinka and Kat's conversation will be followed by an audience Q&A, so we do encourage you to ask questions throughout using the Q&A function on your bottom bar. We're going to address all of those at the end. If you would like to use the closed caption function this evening, please do enable that on your bottom bar as well. Details on how to use all of those features have been posted in the chat. And finally, if you are going to talk about this event online, which we definitely encourage, please do tag us at VA Dundee and do use the speaker's social links, which are also in the chat. That's it from me. I'm going to hand over to our brilliant speakers.
Hi, thanks, Nicole. Evening, everybody. It's very nice to be here and very nice to be with Jeremy Deller and Vinka Peterson, two fascinating and also widely celebrated artists whose work in very different ways documents British rave and club culture, particularly in the late 80s and early 90s, and also reflects on the meaning of those subcultures today. And whose work I'm really delighted to see in the installation at V&A Dundee of the Night Fever exhibition. And I think their work really adds to the kind of British examination of club culture in the show, which is kind of international in its remit. And in particular, that their work thinks about experiences of collective joy, of kind of being together, something we've obviously all been missing in different ways, of politics, of club culture, and also thinks about or helps us to kind of think about how we might document and preserve these kind of stories. And those are some of the themes that I hope we'll be discussing this evening. So welcome, Jeremy and Vinka. It's very nice to have you both here. So give me one moment while I just bring up some of the images that you've seen already. We wanted to have some images in the background for those who aren't so familiar with Jeremy and Vinka's work. And actually what we'll do is I'm going to click through some of the images with the kind of first question that I ask of both Jeremy and Vinka, and then we'll leave the images for now, and we can always come back to them if there's a particular image that that we want to focus on. So I'm going to start with a really straightforward question to ease us in, and in particular to help kind of familiarise those who might not be familiar with your work. And that's very simply that both of you have artworks included in the exhibition, which wasn't actually shown in previous iterations of the show. So I'd very simply like to ask if you could tell us a bit about the work. And I'd like to start with Jeremy first. So I'll just click through some of your images. Jeremy, I know it's of this work and other works, but if you could just talk us through it, that would be great. Thank you.
Yes, so I have mainly really in the exhibition. Oh, just go to the first one if that's all right. Just you stick on that. That's the best one. Number 2, as it is. I've got a film in the show, which I made in 2019 called Everybody in the Place. And it's a film about music culture in Britain in the 80s and early 90s. But it's also social history and maybe a political history of Britain and how the music at the time intersected with the politics of the time, but also the social history of the time and how it informed it. and how, in a way, you can't really separate music from the time it's made in.
Mm.
And it's set in a school. Could you go to the image before, please?
Absolutely.
Just stay on that if that's possible. It's set in a school in the sense that it's not a straightforward documentary. It's actually me giving a talk in a school, and the young people in the class who are politics students respond to the archive I show and what I say. And it's really a way for them to think about Britain before they were born. Also, a lot of the young people, their parents were not born in Britain. So for them, they don't have any folk memory of this time from their parents. So it's them responding to parts of British history that they might not be aware of. So in a way, we're seeing that period of history that we know very well. I say we, people my age, we know very well through the eyes of a group of young people between the ages of 16 and 18. And this image is them in the film. There's technology from that time that's brought into the classroom, and there's a little moment where there's a breakout moment when they make music and they fiddle around with drum machines and programming and so on, and a 303, and just enjoy the technology. And so there's a practical element as well to the film.
I like that moment in the film. It's quite nice seeing them sort of engaging with these technologies for the
first
time.
You get an idea of who they are as well, because otherwise they're just not passively, but they're looking at things and responding to it. But then you see them at play, and that was really important for me. And the image after is just a still from, this is from the film, but the image after is a still from the film, from an incredible piece of archive of Shelley's Laserdome from 1990. And it's just an 18-year-old guy who he tracked down, just went around the club, the early hours of the club really, and just filmed people, a very slow motion shot. And he also filmed the crowd before they went in, which was incredible. It was like 400 or 500 people just queuing up. And then this slow camera weaving around people dancing. It's a very sort of poignant shot, and that's at the end of the film. When I talk about clubs, I talk about small clubs in towns that really transformed towns and how we viewed small towns at the time, or how I did personally. I can talk about other things, but maybe that's enough. I don't know.
No, that's great. Thank you. No, I mean, as someone who grew up, I mean, I wasn't immersed in rave culture. I'd never pretend to be, but I grew up clubbing in small towns, and that's an important part of most people's kind of upbringing, I think. Anyway. And maybe we'll come back to, I mean, there's lots that you'll bring up there, even though sort of those two layers of about rave culture, but also about using rave culture as a way, and as you say, to talk about British history and kind of what it means to be British and all that, but also those layers of different generations coming together. But I think also I'm quite interested in your research process, you know, that very kind of clearly laborious work of finding this kind of amazing footage.
It's actually quite a lot of fun. That's the least terrible part of it, to be honest.
The least terrible part. Well, that's
in a sense, the most terrifying part was standing in front of a group of young people and talking for a day, more or less, about something. And it really made me understand how incredible teachers are, because it's the most tiring thing I've ever done in my life.
Absolutely, yes.
Basically acting. That's how I felt, like I was acting myself.
Yeah. Well, we'll come back to that. Thank you. That was a very nice introduction to your work. And Vinka, if you'd like to join us as well to talk about your work that's included in the exhibition, which is called A Life of Subversive Joy.
Yeah, well, I suppose it all started, I published a book in 1999, which documented my life kind of living on the road with travelers and people putting on free parties, free raves at this point in Europe. So that book covered 10 years, but people often asked, you know, how did you end up there? And then what are you doing now? And so when I was given an opportunity to sort of fill a 23-meter long wall, I thought, well, I'll tell the whole story. So the piece at the V&A it basically starts at the beginning, you know, like any life does. As a child, you know, my hobby was taking photographs, so that stayed with me, and I ended up leaving home, going to live in a squat in London, discovering raving and clubbing, and then turning from sort of being the person that was arriving at these raves to someone that was involved in putting on the raves, and then suddenly getting involved in a very political situation with the criminal justice bill, and actually leaving Britain with the sound systems and going to live in Europe and putting on parties out there. and then coming back and having a child. And then, so the whole thing really is about a life and about sort of anyone's life, really, about the connections and the events and the things that happen to you and where they take you. Yeah, it was kind of it's about me, but I find that a lot of people, when they look at it, reflect back on their own lives. And yeah, that's it. So, and then sort of I was faced also with the fact there was a big space in the middle of the room. So I couldn't resist creating a kind of seating area as well. It was based on a big bed that I made, sort of bed bench, that kind of encouraged people to come and sit down. And rather than getting caught up in that flow, often in modern galleries, of sort of a timed slot and walking through these big white spaces, in a, you know, to the gift shop. And so I created a space where people would sort of stop, they'd sit down, they'd rest their weary legs, the kids might start climbing around on it, mums might get a chance to breastfeed, wherever it may be, and maybe connect with some of the other people around them in the gallery. So in front of the timeline, the Life of Subversive Joy is also a sort of big seating area, which is a bed when COVID allows it to be a bed, but at the moment is 6 sort of smaller beds, which we all push together.
I see. Yeah, I've seen the photographs of that, because I went to the Sweet Harmony exhibition at the Saatchi Gallery where this was first shown, was kind of blown away by it. And yeah, recall that very large, and in fact enjoyed sitting on that very large kind of seating. And I see, yeah, that's pragmatism, isn't it? That you've got it kind of a broken up experience in
Yeah, but it's the same idea of making these spaces a bit more human and a bit more comfortable, and not necessarily forcing people, but encouraging people to interact with each other as well in the space. So not just about looking at things on walls, but about talking about the things on the walls, or maybe just sitting with them for a while. And I remember going to galleries when I was young and sitting there for a long time, and sometimes sketching or doing whatever. And I felt that galleries quite often now, you feel like you've sort of got to move through quite quickly. So yeah.
And I mean, I think it's kind of an incredible work, because it's, as you say, it's document of your life. And it's striking that you've obviously got this kind of documentation, but then we all have, in a way, many of us have kind of scribbled away photographs, or it's all on our phone, or whatever, or flyers from this and that, but not to the extent that you did, not to the kind of quality that you've done. But I'm intrigued, at what point did you become aware that you've got this kind of archive, I guess, or did it become self-conscious at any point that this could become a work, or something to be shown in public?
It really had to be forced down my throat, really, this idea that it was of value beyond me. I originally came back to England with a lot of photographs, and I'd been living on the road on and off for about 10 years at that point. And I actually came back to make 10 photo albums for each of the groups of people I'd been living with. And then someone suggested to me that I published it, and I was like, no way, can't do that. I'll get lynched, I'll get, these are private people doing semi-legal things, But I went back on the road for another year with a mock-up of the book, and went around to try and find all the travelers and the people that were in it. Of course, there wasn't, smartphones like there is now. And took me a year to kind of get their consent. And then I came back, and still in my mind, I was just making a family photo album, but a couple of thousand of them. And then the book came out, and it was published through Steidl, and he actually printed 5,000 of them. And then suddenly it sort of went all over the place. But I kind of pretty much disappeared back off again. But it was at that point. So when the book was published, I realized, that this is of interest beyond me, beyond me and my mates. It's, something, I've recorded something of importance. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And so you can see sort of differences already, obviously, very clearly between the both of your work, in the sense that I think your work is deeply autobiographical, at least certainly this work is. Well, Jeremy, we saw with yours that there's a kind of, there's a sense of remove, certainly in that project. You've got that kind of, as you say, you're playing the teacher, talking about a kind of a subject. to a group of students. So I'm interested to know how much for you this is, club culture is a subject that you look at or that you were part of.
I think you're right to say I was playing the teacher. That's a very accurate way of putting it. I was part of it, not in, I mean, Vinka was immersed in it. It was literally her life. And, a lot of people say, oh, it was my life, but it literally clearly was her life. But for me, it was a very important thing, as it is for most people, but probably just as much as it is for anyone, no more, no less. But at the time when it was happening, especially around 88, 89, I wasn't going to those big raves. So that was a little bit later, but I knew it was important. It was clearly an important moment, I felt. So that's when I began thinking about it seriously, if you could say that. And I did some work in 1995, 1996 about it. I mean, you could, if you wanted to go back to some images, I could show you a few things. Just because even then, well, there we go. I imagined an exhibition about acid house music. And I think I made this, 1996, I made this poster, a series of posters about popular culture and the fact that they could be seen in museums at some point. And it sort of has happened, obviously, but that was the poster I made for an exhibition that never happened. But it has since happened, but I had nothing to do with it. But that's how it feels. If you go back two more, there, just one back. And this was a diagram I made in 1996 to sort of justify me getting a brass band to play acid house music, which is a sort of form of nostalgia, really, for something that had only very recently sort of disappeared in a sense. Acid house was a historical music movement. 8 years since it had started. That's a long time in pop music and dance music culture. So it's already historicized in a sense. But I was making a work with these two music movements about history, about if you can tell a story, a narrative, a story about Britain in the 20th century through music. And that's what this diagram tells as well. But it's also about the genesis of this music, but also how it relates to industrial culture. So I was thinking about it because I knew it was important. I knew it was connected to other things at the time. Hence, and in a way, the film that I just talked about that I made is the film, really. This is the script for the film, effectively. Is this diagram?
Storyboard.
Yeah, it's a storyboard, effectively, for the film I made.
And do you think, in a way, that being sort of involved in it, but not, as you say, kind of immersed in the way that Vinka was, has also informed how you've sort of told the story, or the different stories of kind of club culture, like the medium? You've used film, you've used
maybe I was able to take a step, as opposed to being inside something and just being taken up with it on a day-to-day basis and immersed in it. I could take a step back and look at it in maybe the bigger picture, potentially. But having said that, Vinka's mentioned things that I was interested in about Criminal Justice Act and Criminal Justice Bill as well. As you can see, it's in the diagram. So I do that anyway. I'm the kind of person that does. That's the police going past my flat. That I'm the kind of person that I do stand at the sides. If I go to a nightclub, I often at that time I would go by myself and wouldn't talk to anyone, and I'd just watch people and dance, but then watch people, really. So that's, in a sense, what I do with the art. I'm standing at the side looking at things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you can kind of see that analytical approach. And I guess, so you mentioned the word nostalgia, and it's something that kind of strikes me in both your work in different ways, because you both started making work about the kind of scene at its peak, but also just after its peak, in a way. So, got peak in terms of mass kind of, kind of awareness, kind of a mass phenomenon, I guess, in British culture and internationally, obviously. But also, you're still both making work about it now, which is 30 years or so later. And so I'm interested in how your perspective has changed over time on how you feel about the movement, and also maybe how and what it is that you want to say about the kind of the different scenes.
Can I just, I'll answer quickly my part of that in a way. When I made it in 1996, I was trying to make nostalgia about something that happened very recently, but also nostalgia for a digital culture. I was wondering whether you could be nostalgic for something that was essentially very technologically heavy in a sense, and was about samplers and tech. So that was something I was interested in. Now, 30 years later, making that film, I feel like my work is done effectively. I don't think I'll be making much more, but it's something I needed to get out. But it's a big pressure to make a film about the 1980s and dance music, because there's so many experts. There's millions of people who are experts on this subject. So it was a big pressure to do that, because you'd be
Experts
judged.
because they've lived it, you mean, as in we're all an
Exactly,
expert.
yes, and probably lived it more than I've lived it. And there's, everyone's, most of the people are still around, so they all have their own personal view of this. This is called the history of the world, by the way, this diagram. So everyone has their own view of that moment. So I was very worried about when it was on telly that it would be, people would just write to me outraged. Some were, which was hilarious, because they thought it was a Marxist project and they didn't remember Acid House being a political moment. For them, it was just about getting off their heads. Whereas a lot of people did write, so how much they liked it, including some people that made the record. So I was happy about that. But I feel like I've done it, really. There's no more I can say personally, but maybe it's up to other people to say things.
That was one of my questions towards the end, so I won't ask you if you're going to do some more work on it. Vinka, how about you? How has your perspective changed?
Yeah, I mean, I never really get any feelings of nostalgia. That doesn't really, I don't know, that's not something which resonates with me, because I felt like when I was in it, I mean, it could have been nostalgia, but I felt like I was being part of something which had been happening for thousands of years in different forms. And I kind of feel now that it's happening, it's continuing to happen, in a funny way. It's resurfacing in a similar form to in the 90s. But, it's the essence of it for me is that human beings like to gather and like to have collective experiences, whatever they are. And like Jeremy says, some will be in the middle of it and some will stand at the outside. And actually I was pretty much standing at the edge of the dance floor. I was just at the edge of the dance floor in the scene. But yeah, it never feels nostalgic to me. It always just feels like there's a message and a thread that's been going throughout sort of history, which is this need for collective joy, not all the time, but this release that humans get when they come together in a space and have a chance to kind of lose themselves a little.
Release is a great word, particularly when we haven't been able to release, some sort of pent up kind of need to get together. You kind of see it in a way with the kind of the joy around the football, at the moment. Like there's something about that kind of release that how people are talking about how they need that, to come together.
Well, I always used to talk about football as one of the only places left where you could go and scream and shout and jump around, and that was socially acceptable. But then, paid festivals and things like that started happening, I guess, in the last 10 years.
That's
so
true.
there's more spaces turning up for that sort of thing.
And actually, a nostalgia, and it can be a bit of a dirty word, I think, sometimes, or it can be quite a difficult kind of thing. Jeremy,
Well, no, I was just about to say, I don't like nostalgia. And with the film, I have to add that I was trying to avoid it massively, because a lot of documentaries, rock documentaries, music documentaries, are usually full of men, usually sitting in front of their record collections or a mixing desk, waxing lyrical, being very sentimental about a moment in their lives that they can't really remember, telling these stories. And I didn't really want that with the film. I didn't really like that style of filmmaking. And that's why I made the film with the young people, because they're not nostalgic for it, because they didn't even know it had happened. So it was a device to take that out of it. I mean, having said that, there was a middle-aged guy in the film, and that's me teaching them, but I try and make it quite hard in terms of the politics and what else was going on in Britain. It's not meant to be sort of dewy-eyed. But with the thing with the brass band, I was trying to create a sort of sense of loss, that we'd lost this moment, 88, 89, 90, that had been lost by 1996. It didn't really exist in the way it had existed in the past. And I was trying to manufacture it definitely for that. Hence the brass band. It's a very nostalgic form of music making.
Absolutely, quite poignant. Yeah, I think it's quite poignant. It's kind of come up already. But I think it's quite an interesting device that these are the students, because it helps make it strange. So it sort of defamiliarizes it for everybody. If you start to make it a kind of this sort of odd culture for a group of students to find out about.
Exactly, and you understand how they see things. we talked about the miners' strike a lot, and there's footage of the miners' strike, and one student asked, were they on strike because of climate change? And it's like, wow, that's that's a totally different angle that what I was expecting. And then a lot of young people talked about social media and how that rules their lives, and they can't behave in a certain way and look a certain way, and they don't feel free because of it when they're out and about. They're always sort of kind of surveilling each other and themselves. So that's what I wanted, really. I wanted their perspective on the footage, but maybe it's as much about them as anything, really.
Absolutely. And we've sort of touched on this a little bit, but there's something about the now that's interesting in terms of, why are we interested in this period from sort of 30 plus, nearly 40 years ago. And, we've got both your works came out in 2019. I think that's right in saying. Night Fever exhibition opened in 2018. Sweet Harmony, I think, was also 2019, 18. I'm not going to be too particular on dates because I'm not going to remember them exactly. But the point is, there's quite a few exhibitions in the last few years. And Electronic, which was Electro in Electronic in the Design Museum, which had been Electro in Paris. Like, there've been quite a few exhibitions examining this subject, and there are more films and books kind of planned to come out as well around rave culture. So I guess maybe we may have answered it already, but I guess, what is it? What is it about that period? I mean, it can't just be the cyclical thing of we're all getting, old and sad at not going out anymore, or at least certainly if you're me.
I actually think it is about generationally. It's people who are at an age now where they have some sort of cultural power to put on an exhibition or to think about what's important to them and make a documentary about it. In a way they wouldn't have done in their 20s. And so it's a kind of people in a position to do that. 20 years ago, it was all about punk rock, or even 10 years ago, it was all about punk rock because punk became this huge thing. And then because people of a certain age were commissioning editors or whatever, it sounds cynical, but it's just, I think it is actually a generational thing.
What do you think? Yeah.
I think that's actually an important part of it. But also, it was very underrated at the time in the media, and I think people felt a bit aggrieved of that. I certainly didn't take it seriously. So it's a rebalance, really. I think.
What do you think, Vinka? Do you subscribe to that?
Yeah, I mean, I also think it, what people want is different now. What people are aspiring to and how people want their lives to be has changed quite a lot, maybe in the last 10 or 20 years, and always does. And I think some of the sort of feelings around, these experiences are becoming important and valued, I mean, I talk a lot about joy, but joy used to almost be a sort of difficult word in a way. There seems to be no weight, there was no weight in it, and no, it was almost a sort of silly word. And I have an alter ego called Dr. Joy, who I created to have serious conversations about over seriousness. And so I just think people are looking for something. Maybe it's difficult to describe what it is, but they want that kind of feeling again. They're longing for that feeling again. And obviously, post-pandemic, everyone's desperate for, like I say, release and connection again. I would say, can we change the slide?
Yes. I can remove the
look
slide
at that anymore.
Shall I take them down? Are we should we move to, yeah?
Just not the one of me.
Sorry, Vinka. We'll come on to actually stick with this question of joy, although I do think it's interesting that in particular Jeremy raised that idea of cultural power, the idea that actually is the gatekeepers still of kind of cultural institutions that are key to what gets exhibited, at a time that everything else seems to be being disrupted in some certain ways, and we're challenging the power structures, that actually still the kind of cultural institutions, it's who's in charge determines what kind of programming happens in that way.
I actually see it as a massive, there's pre-dance music or acid house, and there's post. It's like rock and roll in the 50s. Either you're a person that understood and experienced rock and roll music and got it, or you didn't. And I think that there's a real divide between people of a certain age who were part of it and understood it and enjoyed it, and people that didn't and can't talk about it and never experienced it. And I think that's actually a really important thing. I'm just making this up as I go along, but I think I think it's an important sort of divide between people in the way understanding rock and roll music might have been in the 50s and 60s.
But I guess there's a question of how can you ever convince somebody of the merit of something that they willfully don't value in, you know, in that kind of way. Like, will exhibition, you know,
Well, your exhibition might be doing this, so
let's hope so.
I hope so.
No, that's cultural power, isn't it? In a different kind of way. But let's come back to the more joyful subject of joy. You mentioned Dr. Joy, Vinka, that I think we definitely want to hear more about who Dr. Joy is and what they do.
Well, she's in her infancy actually. She was created quite a while ago by a certain single mother that had been stuck at home with a baby for a long time, namely me. But her first incarnation was art nurse, who but then everyone around me seemed to be getting doctorates and becoming doctors, so I thought I ought to promote myself. But she yeah, I think basically I had a conversation with someone one day and they asked me a question and it completely blindsided me. She just said, "Oh, Vinka, you know, you peddle joy. Where's your joy right now?" And I sort of was like, "Oh, yeah, of course my life is full of joy and look, you know, I'm a raver and, you know, I'm ex-raver and all the rest of it." But then I started thinking about this and I started talking to other people about this and I realized that it opened up some really interesting conversations about, you know, priorities and how our lives have become. And like Jeremy was saying, maybe, you know, post sort of dance music and all that, maybe it's linking up with other things that are happening, you know, things that when I was young you didn't really talk about because they were hippie things like meditation or, you know, self-care or whatever it is. And I just, yeah, I created her to sort of teach myself really and also have conversations with other people about where they thought joy was in their lives and where it wasn't and where it was and wasn't in society. And you know what we could do about it. Yeah.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing the next incarnation of Dr. Joy. And Jeremy, is joy something that you peddle, as it were?
Pedal.
Well, that's what as Vinka was told.
Yeah, I know, that's a good point. I mean, this T-shirt might show you
It
the
is.
kind of person I actually am, really, rather than a bit different from Vinka. But
Oh, I've got a dark side, don't worry.
oh yes, but I think, you know, I make work that is full of happiness. It's quite disturbingly so sometimes, like the inflatable Stonehenge I made, which I didn't include an image of, but you can picture it, can't you? But I made an inflatable Stonehenge life size, life to scale, and that's just full of happiness when people are on it. And I do other works that celebrate public space and music, but on the whole, I can be quite miserable. So I do other stuff that's not very nice as well, in the sense that it's not particularly happy. But so it's a bit of both, really. I suspect I'm like most people, that I kind of veer from one to the other. But I'm interested in people behaving en masse and doing things together. I find that very moving when it's done. And so that's something I do. Not that I take part in those things. Again, I'm not really good at taking part in things, but I like witnessing them and watching them. So that's something that for me is very important.
And
Yeah.
There's nothing better than watching people dance, actually. That for me is almost the most amazing thing.
Yeah, I think you're right anyway, in that, you know, joy can't exist without pain or darkness, you know, whatever. You know, we need all of these things, but I think the key point is to feel something, you know, and to connect. Yeah, your bouncy castle was genius, I have to say. And you know, just in a very kind of sort of niche area, which was, you know, as a traveller in a truck driving past Stonehenge so many times and watching it become more and more fortified and less accessible, and you know, wondering how on earth we could live in a culture and society that would let that happen. And then one day sort of I spotted your bouncy castle. That was genius. Can I borrow it?
Yeah, but it's quite a big production, as you can imagine, because it weighs quite a lot just to transport. That was about collective joy, but also it was there was a point about it, about getting in touch with these ancestral places and getting in touch with history and ancient history and enjoying it, rather than being not allowed to go into it and touch it. It was like a very tactile, you had to jump on it literally. And weirdly, there's a big section on Stonehenge in the film I made about Rave, about the travellers trying to get to Stonehenge in '86. There's an incredible documentary the BBC made, amazing documentary, and I just used parts of that to show the young people that how strange Britain was in the '80s, maybe how strange it looked and how people spoke about things and their behaviour. So Stonehenge just crops up everywhere, really.
And has done for such a long time.
Yes.
I think, yeah. I tried to look for what it was, what the essence was, what I found important, and I did end up coining the phrase subversive joy. So, you know, that kind of a joy. So, yeah.
And that, I mean, we should at this point mention that you, the two of you are the only two artists I know of who have worked with bouncy castles, which seems like a niche. If there was to be a diagram of the history of art, it would be a niche kind of section in that.
It'd be a bit boring, it was just us.
No, that's wonderful. What a great area to be in. So we've heard about Jeremy's work, which is interesting because it elicits joy. It's not just a documentation; it's sort of facilitating a wonderful experience. But I think it would be a good moment to hear about also how you've worked with bouncy castles as well.
Yeah, well, I was kind of at an age where I thought I was ought to have a child quite soon. You know, don't know where that thought came from. Anyway, and I thought I'd do something, you know, that I couldn't possibly do with a baby, just to try and get the traveling bug out of my system so I could settle and be, you know, do that. So I decided to drive across West Africa, which I had always wanted to do. And I kind of knew I was going to photograph it and probably film it. And I was in just a 4x4 car. And then I started thinking, what on earth am I going to take with me? Because I don't want to just turn up and photograph, you know, where's the joy in that? So I started thinking about, you know, what am I going to fill the car with? Like, you know, footballs, you're only going to get a very limited number of footballs and they're all going to be given away in Morocco. Let's face it, you're not going to get very far. Then I was like, condoms, brilliant, they're tiny, but then, you know, again, they're going to run out. So I had to try and think of a sort of a form of inexhaustible aid or inexhaustible gift, and I thought of a bouncy castle. I'd lived with a circus for a while, and so this idea of something arriving and creating this spectacle and possibly, you know, touching the people, well, definitely touching the people that witness it, and they don't have to possess it. You know, in fact, the fact that it suddenly appears and then suddenly disappears is part of its magic. So I persuaded a friend of mine to sponsor a bouncy castle. So we end up driving across West Africa with a bouncy castle and getting it off the roof of the car every now and then and sort of putting it up. Yeah, and that brought a lot of joy. Although it was quite intense, I could tell you, because they're quite excited if you turn up with a football in some of these very remote villages, let alone a bouncy castle. But it worked.
But I love also that you talk about the kind of the performance of it being inflated as kind of part of, you know, that kind of excitement that generates as being part of the experience, really, isn't it, of encountering that. And you've got good friends who can sponsor you with a bouncy castle.
Yeah, he had some money at the time. He's skint now, but
all right, well, maybe that
bouncy castles.
Jeremy, did you want to add something into that?
Well, no, when the Stonehenge was filled with air, it was actually quite a kind of sexual. It looked quite sexual because it was like this kind of these stones were erected and they
on the way up,
and then at the end of the day they sort of deflated, and it was quite comic actually. It was very funny, and bouncy castles or the Stonehenge inflated very quickly, so, you know, in minutes, so you could watch it in real time. It wasn't something to come back to. It'd be there within minutes. It'd be there. And so there is sort of absurdity as well about taking Stonehenge on tour. That was something I was very excited about, that people would go on it one day, and like you said, Vinky, the next day it was just a memory. It had gone, and it is like the circus coming to town for one night. This thing happens and then it's off and it's just gone somewhere else, and there's a magic to that as well, I think. and just a strangeness to see Stonehenge in your local park if you weren't expecting it to see it there on the horizon, in the morning. All those things for me were very important. That idea of a journey around Britain or wherever, around London. That was really kind of going on tour. Stonehenge on tour was very important for me.
And that idea of the kind of the journey of the experience of the ephemeral, the intangible, the memories, like this is obviously a lot of this is what we hold on to from experiences of clubbing or kind of rave culture in general. So I wanted to slightly change tack to think about the kind of the museum context in terms of your work, because both of your works seek to elicit experiences or about experiences about this ephemeral, the intangible, the experiential, not things. But of course, a museum is about things, and certainly with Night Fever, one of the challenges we had was how can you find objects? For one thing, there's a kind of curatorial challenge, any remaining, kind of physical remains of club culture, but also that those objects only go so far in terms of what they can tell. A speaker on its own doesn't really kind of do much to tell the story of rave culture. So I guess I had a couple of questions for you linked to that. One was, how do you feel about having your works in the museum context? And I say that partly with Jeremy, like the film was shown first on television, rather than, say, for a gallery context. Obviously, Vinken, I remember reading about your No System book, that it was key that it was like $9.99, so it was sort of accessible. Anybody could kind of buy it. So things that neither of those things are, television and being a kind of cheap book are things we think about in terms of the museum. So how do you feel about having your works in that kind of context? But also, how do you think that we should think about preserving and communicating this set of cultures?
If I go first, maybe it's almost inevitable, isn't it? If something's important, something's culturally, it will end up in a museum. It's just what happens, and it's how we show we value something, by keeping it safe somewhere, even though it's just like a flyer for a gig or whatever. It's kept as safely as a drawing by Michelangelo, let's say. And that's an exaggeration, but it shows what we value and what's important. And I think people like seeing that, maybe when they go to museums, seeing themselves reflected back in the fact that they might have this object, or they went to this place, and maybe it's a validating experience. But of course, there's dangers in that, aren't they? Just making very populist shows around big subjects, and are popular. But it's how you do it. It's the skill in the curating to make an interesting experience, but also, maybe one that has some sort of ideology behind it as well, some thought behind it. But like I said, it's why I made that poster you saw that I showed you with the smiley face on it, because I thought these things were important and they should be in museums, and probably they would be at one point, because if punk can be in a museum, then why not anything else, really, or rock and roll, or whatever. So for me, it's a natural occurrence, really.
That's quite a positive way of thinking of it, isn't it? In a way that if it has value, it will be recognised, because arguably lots of things have value.
It's fragments, isn't it? It's obviously a fragmentary thing, but then most museums are made up of fragments, of parts of buildings, of parts of things. So just to have a speaker, or you are making things into like almost a shrine of kind of relics of a moment, that the moment was 30 years ago, not 4,000 years ago. But it's just showing confidence in the culture and saying you believe in it and it's important and it means a lot to people. So I think that's fine. I mean, I don't have any memories from those years. I went to so many clubs and events. I can't remember anything about them, not because I was drugs or alcohol. Just can't remember. You can remember a vague feeling about them, but I can't remember anything about what happened in them, really. Maybe that's a good thing, because I wasn't trying to remember stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Not being too analytical, but actually in the
moment. No, not at all.
How about you, Vinka?
Yeah, I mean, I just see them as places that I can, continue to play with, play in and bring people in and share. I just see it as maybe a new audience, reach. The idea is to reach as many as possible, and to, I mean, with the V&A, the seating area had canvases on top of it, so I found someone on Instagram that I thought was interesting, that was a local artist in Dundee, and got him to come and design one of the covers for the seating area. And then we ended up sort of chatting a lot, and we ended up doing a zine together, which I think the gallery is now giving out free in the gallery as well, and it's being given out all around Dundee and further afield. So I don't feel contained by those spaces. I just feel like they're a starting point to sort of branch out, and always interesting to see who you'll meet or what connections you'll make, in different types of spaces. Yeah, not that different from a giant warehouse space I've broken into and done a huge rave in.
I think you meant to break into V&A Dundee, though. I think that might be frowned on.
Well, they didn't have to.
Yeah, you got invited in. I feel like maybe we can have one more question, and then we can move on to seeing if there are any kind of audience questions, which actually your kind of answer connects to, which is that we've had an elephant in the room, which is the pandemic, of course, in the last year or so, which I imagine must have affected how, particularly Vinka, for you, how you put together the installation. I see you smiling and are slightly relieved by maybe that was over and done with. But also we're thinking about, clubs have been empty, and that there have been obviously some raves happening, but generally that's been it's been a kind of suppressed culture for the last 18 months or so. So I'm intrigued as to any thoughts that you might have on what you went through in terms of what the pandemic has meant for you in documenting this, but also how you think we might want to kind of deal with this in, let's say, 30 years time, the time when we didn't dance together.
I think for me personally, it was just a moment to stop, and it was bizarre. I was offered a studio space by the Goethe Institute in London to create another piece around collective joy, similar to the timeline, and I ended up in this huge sort of 6-story building, alone, apart from a security guard downstairs, in the middle of, on Exhibition Road, in the middle of London, alone, with a room full of pictures and work that I was doing around, giant sort of collective experiences. So it was bizarre, but then, it's about human spirit. It's not about the actual times. And I'm absolutely excited about this summer and what's going to happen. This idea that there are young people out there that have been effectively kettled for a year, get a load of ravers, kettle them for a year, and then let them out. It's going to be brilliant. I can't wait to see what happens. Yeah,
absolutely. Jeremy, what about your thoughts on that?
About what in particular? Sorry, about the pandemic and.
Well, yeah, I guess just in terms of how we might want to document, this moment when we didn't dance in 30 years' time or now. I mean, there has been some interesting work.
I know people are collecting, aren't they, already? I know museums are collecting. Museum of London is, Science Museum is, V&A is. So collections are being made of material about the pandemic, but that's not going to be about people's social lives as such, maybe, or dancing. But it was quite encouraging to see that, that first sort of public event, that first public test, what they call it, was in Liverpool, that club. Yeah. Which looked like a sort of proper old school rave, really, because it was in a big warehouse. I don't know if the club is a warehouse, but it was in a warehouse, and it seemed very healthy indeed. People's appetite to go back to clubbing, and I thought it was very, very funny watching all the news stories about it. So I think that all those pieces to camera by news reporters, very serious, live, and behind them there's just like carnage with these young people staggering around. So I think, obviously there's a lot of pent-up energy which will manifest itself. It might even be sort of kind of new music movement, who knows, from this. It's something's going to happen, isn't it? So
well, it might be just saying...
I'm too old to be part of anything, but I will watch happily from a distance with earplugs in. So yeah,
you never know what's, there might be, as you say, it might be, if there's a pre-punk, post-punk, it might be a pre-pandemic, post-pandemic in terms of our music culture, but we will wait and see.
Inevitably, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's been like a huge experiment, hasn't it, really, that we've sort of inadvertently become part of a huge, experiment on so many levels, culturally as well.
Absolutely.
And right at the beginning, of course, we all thought, wow, maybe as an artist or as someone that likes to document things, thinking, my God, this is so exciting. And I'm sure everyone's been, gathering work around it or thoughts around it. And yeah, we just need some time to digest, don't we?
But maybe the last thing we want to see is a show about a pandemic. We have to wait 10 years.
Sorry to say.
The anniversary.
There might be a few.
Great, exactly. A great, the anniversary, the great whatever, in 10 years' time.
And I think for me, 2020 has already become a vague feeling, to quote you, Jeremy. Like I think that's how I might like it to remain.
Yes.
Nicole, I think if there seems like a good moment maybe to see if there are any questions for our speakers.
Yeah, we do have a couple. The first one is thinking about Jeremy's experience of presenting the unfamiliar to young people. Vinka, how do you think that your personal stories from A Subversive Life of Joy resonate with the multi-generational audiences that are coming to see the show?
Yeah, it was interesting actually when I was looking at that slide that Jeremy showed, and I've seen the film as well. I'm always amazed by the fact that so many different types of people connect with the work. I'm very much in the work, but it's the audience that have opened my eyes, really. And I get messages from all over the world, different types of people, different ages, and many people have many different reactions. But it seems to for such personal work, I'm very surprised that it acts as a mirror to everyone else's lives and experiences. But it's a massive relief to me, because the last thing I wanted to do was do a piece all about me. So yeah, I mean, I loved watching that scene in the film where they, again, there's something very human about things that we all get drawn to, or we get drawn to in slightly different ways, and it's that moment of release where instead of being a group of people, they become individuals, and they put their stamp on the moment. They want to play this part of the music, or they want to dance in that way. Yeah, and I think that's universal.
Yeah. The next question is just kind of elaborating. You've both kind of discussed and spoken about your personal experiences of clubbing itself. Jeremy, you've mentioned standing on the edge of it and kind of watching in, and Vinka, you've mentioned being a real part of it, being a rave grower, a rave builder. And there's an interest in the extent in which you feel clubs and club spaces encourage people to actually be present in the moment rather than kind of removed from it.
How in terms of club design, you mean, or how I suppose being present? It's probably phones are like a real problem in that respect, aren't they? I imagine people. I mean, you do. I do look at a lot of footage of people at sort of raves and clubs and stuff, and you can just see it online very easily. And sometimes it's people just go to film the light show, which is not really the point, is it? But you see a lot of that. But I think to be in the moment, you just have to be wrapped up in it, don't you? And just the music has to be something that you want. You've got to be the right people. It's just a set of circumstances. But it's almost so long ago now. But I think the music is probably still, for me, was the most important thing when I was going out.
But I would say, in terms from the design perspective, like some of the architects who've designed nightclubs have talked about, like Nigel Coates, who designed clubs, also wrote about them. He talks about spaces for watching, but also being watched, like being built into the design as much as you can never design people's behavior, but like understanding that those two kind of ways of being are kind of part of why you go out, or why different people, kind of go out to clubs.
Like podiums and mirrors, all those things that you can, and then sort of, when you kind of look down on people dancing. But I think mirrors are quite interesting in clubs, because you check yourself out as well, don't you, as well as other people.
The next question is, as clubs play such a pivotal role in our lives, do you think we should be teaching club history in the curriculum? I think this is aimed a bit towards Jeremy. Maybe using it as a way to navigate something like modern studies or local history?
I think local history would be very interesting, because I think you were saying earlier that it felt like for a moment that every town or even village has or had a nightclub, and that was such an important place to go, wasn't it? It's like people's alternative homes for a while. But I knew about Britain in the 80s really through the clubs. They were these legendary nightclubs that had these incredible nights and these people playing there, and they had these great followings. So I don't. People may have forgotten that, but they changed the personality and the way you looked at Britain, I think, of the clubs that were in these towns, and so that could be interesting for local history, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say something about that as well. I think it's interesting, what we're encouraged to learn about and what we aren't, even though something could be quite a major phenomenon and a major part of a lot of people's lives. It's thought of as not it's not allowed to hold the space in education, and yeah, we've always had village halls and village dances, and back in the day, dances were churches had you didn't have pews, you danced, and that was all right, but for some reason this dancing is a little threatening or something. um yeah, maybe it's something we're not going to be encouraged to do through education.
I mean, it's quite interesting we're talking about the design of nightclubs, because Vinca especially, and a bit me as well, we went to places that were never designed to be nightclubs, and they were designed to be warehouses or factories or in the open air. So they're almost undesigned. They were non places, basically. They weren't the clubs that we think of that are beautiful inside. They were actually very raw spaces, potentially quite dangerous. So it's very different from the design of a nightclub, the conscious design of a nightclub.
Yeah, and sometimes I question, like, who's allowed in our public spaces. Why is it we have to go and find these hidden spaces, go into the woods or go into break into a warehouse? Surely there are spaces we could use, but what parts of our society are actually allowed to use those spaces and in what way?
But going into the woods and breaking into a building is probably part of the experience, though, isn't it? And then finding the party by going around, and so the quest for the party is very important. So maybe that's the thing. And those raves are probably a reaction against the nightclubs in the centres of town, which were very heavily policed by bouncers, and you wouldn't get in necessarily, especially if you were black. You basically had to dress like you were going to a wedding or going to work. So this was definitely something different. The spaces were very important.
Yeah, free spaces. I mean, I've witnessed so many times sort of people arriving in those spaces and just shedding something. Instead of going to a space and feeling you've got to stay in a certain way and behave in a certain way and have quite a lot of money in your pocket, you're actually entering a space where it's like a giant sort of playground or a free space. People go wild very healthily.
But then I guess there is an element of those spaces there is kind of a design conversation about the fact that those spaces promote that idea of shedding the unnecessary to be in them, and they happen in those kind of unusual spaces or those unknown spaces, and that is part of that designed experience to some extent, because you couldn't do it in a club that was designed in a very different way.
No, I mean, the illegality of it is important as well. Makes it special, doesn't it? And naughty, which is popular culture. Popular music should always have that element to it. Going back to rock and roll in the 50s, and up to that moment, misbehaviour is obviously a very important part of it. So
yeah, also, the length of time you're allowed to stay in the space as well. It's quite interesting with illegal spaces, because it goes through many different sort of stages. You arrive and there's a giant crowd and it's dark and there are strobe lights on, and you get very lost in this space, but it's quite exciting. And then 7 hours later it still could be quite dark, but everyone's a bit more tired and you're just kind of in more of a trance state. You know what I mean? And you know, in history they used to talk about ecstatic dancing, you know, dancing until you are in an ecstatic state, and they believe they then, you know, were in communication with the gods, for example. And you know, you see people get in more of a sort of personal space in a way. And then, you know, by Sunday night the space is almost empty, but you've still got these huge sound systems, so you can walk into a room and be completely immersed in sound, you know. And a club night is over like that, you know. So yeah.
Our next question is coming from someone from Scotland, discussing the fact that lots of nightclubs in Scotland that supported club culture have closed over the last 10 years, and wanted to get your thoughts on whether there should be something policy-wise enacted to protect these venues, similarly to how Berlin has declared nightclubs as cultural institutions by giving them tax breaks, protection from displacement, exemption from noise restrictions, and so on and so forth. Do you think there's enough protection for these spaces at the moment? And if not, have you got any thoughts on what could be done?
Well, there should absolutely be more protection and more valuing. I mean, to take one direction or one perspective, you know, the government extols the value, the huge economic contribution of our creative industries, of which clubs are a massive part, and yet, you know, there's no recognition that these are actually part of the creative industries, if you want an economic argument for it. But there's all sorts of other reasons why, you know, it's not at all the economics of why club culture should be valued, and these institutions should be valued and kind of their heritage considered, which people are doing. You know, there is work by heritage organisations in Scotland and in England who have been doing some work. But I think hopefully this is just the start of some recognition of that.
Well, yeah, maybe this show will help. And if that's the case, then maybe that's a good thing. Because pubs can be protected, can't they, as community assets? But I don't know if clubs have the same protection as pubs do. I have no idea. But it must be quite traumatic seeing a place you used to love going to, or you were still going to, just demolished or turned into something else.
Yeah, and it's back to that question of who's in charge, you know, who's making these decisions. And I'm always hopeful that, you know, we're going to start making these decisions, you know.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, we're almost at a point where most senior politicians could have had a dance music youth, as it were. If you look at the current cabinet, you can't imagine any of them.
Or at least pretended to have done.
Who has?
They could at least pretended to have done for street cred. You know, there might be a kind of
but you know, it's not the case.
I might have some inside information on this subject.
There is footage of someone who looks like David Cameron at a rave. I don't know if you know about that, but the Daily Mail found it. You should look it up because it probably is him actually. But it's just, again, maybe in 10 years' time, people might be in power who have a history of this and a memory of it and want to preserve it. You never know. Like a culture minister who actually likes culture.
It's quite frightening, isn't it, that we're sitting here talking about this and we all want it, and yet there's this small group of people that we think are the only people that can decide whether we can have it or not. Yeah. What are we going to do?
That's it, right? The agency of club culture is something that, you know, that's what, you know, the part of your movement is about, I guess. You know, Vinca in particular, like that agency of just do it for yourself, right?
Yeah, and it not to be about ulterior motives, it to be about the music and collective experience, not about making money or, you know, all the other things, or and being released from the fear of, you know, what society says we can and can't do. Yeah, so the DIY element was incredibly important, and again feeds back into the feeling that you get when you're in the space, that you have some power, even just as one of the 1,000 people that enter the space. You know, people used to create all sorts of things when they arrived there as well. They didn't just dance all night. You know, graffiti artists were in heaven, you know, and people made sculptures, and, you know, the musicians played and interplayed, and, you know, yeah, amazingly creative spaces. Why are they so frightening?
Do we think they would maybe lose something if they had this kind of like policy stamp of approval? Because again, you've both talked quite eloquently about the kind of DIY nature and the illicitness of it, and then being the illegality of it being quite important to the element of ownership, and whether, if policy was in place that protected that and allowed it to become a legal activity, would it to some extent, because then it would obviously exist under regulation as well to some extent.
Are we talking about that really? I thought we were talking about protecting spaces rather than activities as such. I don't know. I think there could be more protection for spaces, especially if a club is successful and it has to close because of some issue. I think that's the thing, isn't it?
I think people go to clubs for one experience and they go to an illegal rave for another, and they don't necessarily have to be separate. I mean, I go to one for one thing or another for another.
They can happily
They
coexist.
complement each other, really.
I think we have time for one last question, and it is if kind of the content of shows and exhibitions and things like that are generational, as in the kind of generation of people who are in the positions to curate those things or put those things on. Just thinking about the rave culture shows and exhibitions that are being produced now, what kinds of shows do you think might be produced in 20, 30 years? What do you think would be represented by that generation?
I think there should be a museum of memes. That's what I really like at the moment. Someone can make a collection of really, the best 1,000 memes. I would happily go and see that. But I don't know. That's in a way, it's not really, well, it is for us to think about, but it's whatever's important to people at the moment will be something that will still be important to them, hopefully in 20 years' time.
But it's also totally the point that we're not meant to be able to answer that question. I mean, like even with Night Fever, like we were always clear that we were, we'd sort of try and bring it up to contemporary, but actually the aim was never to capture everything that's going on historically, but also certainly not everything that's going on today, because I'm not meant to know like what's the really, like, I mean, I'm going to use the wrong words, the coolest thing, whatever it is, the kind of most underground, like that's, once I know about it, it's not that anymore. So I'm delighted. I'll be looking forward to seeing what the exhibitions are in 30 years' time.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I think the surprise is part of the fun.
Yes.
I think, unless any of you have a final question for each other, I think that pretty much brings us to a close.
No, that was very interesting. Thank you very much.
Happy.
You're happy. That's the important thing. And hopefully Vinca's happy, full of joy.
Full of joy. You've all been a joy.
Have we not?
Well, all that's left for me to do is just thank Jeremy, Vinca and Kat for such an interesting discussion, and wish everyone a wonderful evening. And that brings us to a close.
Thank you very much.
Cheerio.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.